Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. I'm sure you all know by now what's been going on in Ukraine. The situation is very serious, and even though I don't have anything particularly unique to say about this, I still figured that I should quickly put this out and comment on what's going on. So, first, a little historical background. Until 2014, Ukraine had an elected government led by a president named Yanukovych, and this government was favorable to Russia, and they had pretty good relations with Russia. And that obviously suited Russia just fine, but the West wasn't too happy about it. So in 2014, the United States sponsors a coup in Ukraine. This coup was also supported by the EU. And the way this coup happened was that there was a protest movement against Yanukovych called Euromaidan. And partially this protest movement was pro-EU. At the same time as these demonstrations were going on, far-right neo-Nazi groups and fascist groups basically carried out a putsch and they overthrew the government. The bulk of the demonstrators were just random people. They were not Nazis, they were not fascists, but there were a ton of fascists in the demonstration, and they used the demonstration kind of as a shield and as a cover so that they could carry out the coup. And the main forces who carried out the coup were a fascist party called Svoboda and their paramilitary organization called Pravi Sector, which means right sector. And you can find tons of pictures of these guys in the demonstrations, and they were actually the ones who were able to basically be the muscle, the violent organization that was able to topple the government, with the backing of the United States and CIA and the EU. And I'm sure that the protest against Yanukovych was somewhat legitimate. After all, Yanukovych was just a typical corrupt capitalist president, so no doubt people would have a problem with him. But the movement also wasn't fully organic. It was funded and supported by Western powers, and then especially they started supporting these fascists. Around the same time that this coup happened, there started to be a lot of fascist violence, and this violence mainly targeted people who were ethnic Russians or who spoke Russian. And this is because these fascists, they're basically far-right Ukrainian nationalists. They hate foreigners, they hate Russians. So they basically carried out a ton of hate crimes. And as a result, the people in eastern Ukraine, many of whom are ethnically Russian or speak Russian, were very afraid of these fascists. So in 2014, since Yanukovych was ousted, this dude named Petro Poroshenko became the president of Ukraine. And he's often called a Ukrainian oligarch. And this is because he's a right-wing billionaire. A guy named Arseniy Yatsenyuk became the prime minister. And the government that was formed in 2014 was basically a coalition. There were a number of changes in the government, and I'm not going to get into all those details, it's not really important. But the main point is that it was a coalition between mainly 3 parties and also a bunch of different parliamentary groups and factions. One of the parties was Svoboda, which is considered a fascist, ultranationalist, neo-Nazi party. Before they were called Svoboda, they were called the SNPU, or Social National Party of Ukraine, and they used Nazi symbols. Other parties in this coalition were Ukrainian Democratic Alliance for Reform, which was a more liberal capitalist party, pro-Western, pro-EU party, and then the All-Ukrainian Union Fatherland, which is also a right-wing nationalist party, but not quite as hardcore as the neo-Nazi Svoboda. This government changed a bunch of laws. So what do fascists always do? Well, they always start by banning the communists and banning socialists and starting to ban leftists and Democrats of all kinds. And that's also what happened in this case. So they banned communism in Ukraine. So communist organizations were outlawed, even though they didn't do anything wrong. They hadn't committed any crimes, but they were still banned. Nazis, naturally, were not banned. They could run rampant, and they could be even in the government. There were lots of people in the government apparatus, the police apparatus, and the military who were Nazis. They also changed the language laws so that Russian and other minority languages were no longer recognized, only Ukrainian was recognized. And this was seen by people in eastern Ukraine as yet another threatening sign of basically racial hatred towards them, which is exactly what it was. So while they changed these laws and they started to oppress Russian speakers and they banned communists, and there were hate crimes against Russian speakers, beatings and killings, there was also the famous Nazi terror attack in Odessa, where immediately after this, the Nazis are just running rampant, so they burned this trade union building in Odessa, where there were 48 people who were still inside the building, and they all died. They were burnt alive by Nazis. But even after this, of course, the Nazis, they still get to run rampant, but the communists and the trade unionists, they are oppressed, and the Nazis get to just kill them. So a separatist movement emerges in eastern Ukraine because they basically now fear for their lives. They don't want to be governed by Nazis. They don't, they're under immediate threat of violence and death. So the civil war in Ukraine starts, and the United States and its allies, the EU, and even Israel supports the government in western Ukraine. There were actually a bunch of activists in Israel who were trying to campaign to stop Israel from providing weapons to Ukrainian neo-Nazis, which is quite something. But that didn't work. Israel still is providing weapons to them. And in the civil war, the neo-Nazis have their own military organization, which is called the Azov Battalion, and if you look at pictures of them, they use Nazi symbols. Imagine what kind of government has neo-Nazi armed battalions fighting in their army. And Russia, of course, provided aid to the people in eastern Ukraine. So the United States and their allies is backing the government in western Ukraine, while Russia is backing the people in eastern Ukraine. At this point, Russia also occupied Crimea, which is this small territory between Ukraine and Russia. So Russia occupies that because it's strategically important. I think there was a Russian military base there. And now let's get to the geopolitics of all this. So what the United States wants to do is they want to spread NATO as far east as possible. So NATO has been expanding tremendously ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, even though famously NATO promised that they wouldn't expand east. Well, that's a lie. They have expanded continuously. And also, the whole justification for having NATO was that supposedly it was needed to defend countries from the Warsaw Pact, but the Warsaw Pact is gone, so there is no justification for having NATO anymore. So the Western imperialists have just continuously been lying. It never even made sense in the first place, because NATO was formed first, and the Warsaw Treaty was actually formed after NATO. So it was actually the Warsaw Pact, the Warsaw Treaty Organization, which was formed in response to NATO and not the other way around. But, what do they care? The imperialists are a bunch of liars. They've wanted to expand NATO to the east, and they've wanted to surround Russia as much as possible, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan and Ukraine and a bunch of countries, they split from the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was split into several countries, which were all now much weaker, and they were doing economically very poorly when capitalism was introduced, and generally those countries were just economically, militarily, and politically very weak, so the West was able to spread their influence, spread NATO, and kind of just dominate them. But eventually, Russia again became politically more independent and more powerful, and now they've wanted to start rolling this back, so they want to now push NATO away. So Russia, I think in 2008, intervened in Georgia, and obviously now in 2014, they annexed Crimea and started supporting the separatists in Ukraine. And that's because they don't want the countries that are bordering Russia, they don't want those countries to join NATO. They don't want the US to be able to bring military forces and weapon systems into those countries, which is kind of understandable. The US wouldn't like it if Russia brought massive weapon systems to Mexico or something, nor did they particularly like when the USSR brought missiles to Cuba. How did the US react when the USSR brought missiles to Cuba? Oh yeah, they tried to commit hundreds of assassination attempts against Cuban leaders, and they tried to invade Cuba. So, I mean, it just failed, but not for lack of trying. So that's basically what's behind all of this. The US, they want Ukraine to become basically an American puppet and an American military base so that they can use it to surround and pressure Russia. And Russia wants to stop that. They either want Ukraine to be their ally, their puppet, or at least neutral. And they might still achieve that, but we shall see. And it was the United States who started this. Like, they organized a coup. The US sponsored a coup to topple the elected government of Ukraine in 2014. But I mean, that's kind of par for the course. They've done that hundreds of times all over the world, and they're still doing it, so, it's not really a surprise. The United States, they can always admit long after the fact, like, oh yeah, back then, yeah, we couped that guy, oh yeah, we assassinated that guy, oh yeah, we invaded that country. But when they're actually doing it, they can't admit it, of course. So when they're actually doing it, they have to deny it. So that's why in 2014, and still to this day, the Ukrainian coup, it's still portrayed as some kind of democratic revolution or something. And they try to hide the fact that there's so many Nazis in there. Back in the day, especially in 2014 and 2015, the Western media just said that, oh yeah, that's a Russian lie. There's no Nazis. The Russians are just lying and claiming that there's Nazis. It's a fabrication, but no. Nowadays we know that there actually were and there actually are a ton of Nazis in Ukraine. And not just in Ukraine, but in the government and in the military, and being supported by the Western governments. So, after 8 years of civil war, Russia has invaded Ukraine now. They invaded, I think it was at midnight between 24th and 25th of February. And they're not doing it because they're crazy, or because Putin is crazy, or because he has a small penis or something. No, they're doing it for two main reasons. One, for military and geopolitical reasons, so they just don't want Ukraine to become a Western military base. They want to stop that. And for a long time, they were demanding, okay, Ukraine just needs to give us some kind of guarantee, just some kind of gesture of peaceful intent. So they were saying this for quite a long time. For a while they were threatening that if they can't find any kind of peaceful solution, then this is what is going to happen. And yeah, they have now invaded. Russia claims that they have invaded as some kind of humanitarian mission to protect people of eastern Ukraine. That's what they claim. Of course, that's not actually accurate. They're doing it because of geopolitical, strategic reasons, and also because of reasons of capitalist profit. So people have been talking about the gas pipeline and other things like that, where the US and Russia, they both want to export gas to Europe, and the pipeline goes through Ukraine. There have also been attempts to build other pipelines that go around Ukraine. That's also relevant to this. The US claims that they are somehow protecting the world from Russia, and Russia claims that they're protecting eastern Ukraine from evil Nazis. Well, they're both lying, of course. They're both imperialist powers. Russia is an imperialist capitalist power, and the US is an even bigger imperialist capitalist power. They both just want to increase their sphere of influence. They both just want control over markets, control over resources, control over access to cheap labor. They both just want to dominate and rule other countries. And Marxists, sometimes they get fixated on the fact that the US is the worst imperialist in the world. Yes, that's true, but that doesn't mean that other imperialist powers don't exist. Just because the US is more powerful doesn't mean that Russia isn't an imperialist, capitalist, reactionary right-wing power. It's true that Russia is reacting to something that the US is doing, but that still doesn't mean that Russia is not an imperialist power and that this is not an imperialist action. Just like the coup that the US sponsored was an imperialist act, the invasion is also an imperialist act. Russia claims that it's trying to defend people of eastern Ukraine. Yeah, they're kind of doing that, but they're not doing it because of that. That's just a convenient thing that they get to say. They just want to stop the US from being in Ukraine, and they just want to control markets and resources. They don't actually care about protecting anybody, because people don't like Nazis, and because especially Russians don't like Nazis. It's very convenient for Russia to say, oh look, there's Nazis. Well, yeah, of course there are, but it's still just an excuse. Russia itself is a highly anti-communist power. Russia represses communists also, just like the Nazis do and just like the US does. And this pretty much is the Marxist position. The KKE, the Communist Party of Greece, they just recently published a joint statement of communist and workers' parties called No to the Imperialist War in Ukraine, which I will link in the description. It puts a lot of the blame on the Western imperialists because they are basically the ones who started this, but they also make it perfectly clear that Russia is not really acting in the so-called best interest of Ukrainians, or because they're some kind of anti-imperialist or anti-fascist power or something. Russia is an imperialist power, just like the EU and just like NATO and the US are. Lenin's main teaching about imperialism was that we shouldn't side with any imperialist power. The reason that the Second International collapsed and the Third International, the Communist International, was formed was because the Second International started supporting imperialism. The German Social Democrats started supporting the German government, which was imperialist. The Russian Social Democrats started supporting the imperialist Russian government. And again, there's a danger of that now. Some people want to support the imperialist Russian government. Our solidarity should be with the peoples and the working class of Russia and Ukraine. We should oppose Western imperialism. We should oppose NATO, the EU. We should oppose Nazis and fascists and nationalists, and also Russian imperialism. For a while now, even in eastern Ukraine, Russia has tried to support people who suit their imperialist interests more, and they have tried to prevent any kind of legitimate communists from gaining power there. But obviously, what we in other countries can do is rather limited, so mostly we can just tell people what this is really about, and it's very important that we support peace. That's the most important thing, that's priority now, that we have to support peace and oppose war. Oppose war on Russia. We have to oppose the participation of our governments in NATO, or in NATO military drills, or in any kind of military actions. There was a very good statement put out by the Swedish Communist Party, which clearly states that Russia is not an anti-imperialist power. In fact, Russia is an imperialist power itself. But of course, the biggest imperialist power is the Western Bloc, and that our most important task now is to defend peace, oppose imperialist war, because that's what this is. This is a conflict between two imperialist powers. In a conflict between two imperialist powers, we don't have a side that we support. We don't choose between two imperialist powers, oh, which one do we want to support? No, that's not how it works. The statement said completely correctly that Finland and Sweden need to stay out of NATO, need to stop all of their collaboration with NATO, need to stop any kind of military collaboration with each other. All talk of some kind of military alliance between Finland and Sweden has to stop, because that's just another way that the West tries to get them more militarily integrated into Western imperialism, and they need to stop all collaboration with NATO. How is this all gonna end? Well, I obviously don't know. I think the most likely outcome is that Russia topples the Western-backed Ukrainian government and imposes a new government that's backed by Russia. However, I read yesterday in a newspaper that Russia and Ukraine both have stated that they are ready to negotiate, so maybe there will be some kind of diplomatic solution where Russia doesn't topple the Ukrainian government and Ukraine somehow becomes neutral. We shall see. Of course, it's possible that Russia is militarily defeated, but I think that's unlikely. Of course, it's also possible that Russia just conquers all of Ukraine, but I think that's also not as likely. Some people ask me if it's true that Russia has threatened Finland. The Finnish foreign minister stated yesterday that it's false. For a long time, Russia has made statements like, if Finland joins NATO, then Russia doesn't like it. or Russia is going to take that into account. They've said that for years, but they haven't exactly threatened us or anything like that. If anything, this just demonstrates that joining NATO would be an incredibly bad idea. It wouldn't benefit this country in any way. It would only escalate the conflict between the two imperialist blocs, and it would turn this country, or any country who joins NATO, is just going to be turned to a battleground between two imperialist powers. The United States, they don't care. They're completely willing to turn this country too into a battleground, just like they've turned Ukraine into a battleground. The Ukrainians suffer, the Finnish people would suffer, but the American government, they don't care. So joining NATO would be an incredibly bad idea. The best thing to do is to just stay out of this. This is a conflict between two imperialists. Any country that stays out of this war and stays out of these military blocs is supporting peace. Look at what the West has done to Ukraine. They told Ukraine, oh yeah, we support you, we back you. They orchestrated the coup there and then started using Ukraine against Russia, have been egging them on and provoking this conflict and kind of pouring fuel into the fire. But now that Russia has invaded Ukraine, the West hasn't done anything. The West has not protected Ukraine, and they can't protect Ukraine. So the West has just completely screwed Ukraine. So it would be an incredibly bad idea to join NATO, because that's what they're going to do to you. They're just going to use you against Russia and let you suffer the consequences. While the American billionaires, they just sit in their mansions and they're completely fine. And the people suffer.